Hey guys, tonight we're talking about bread. Not the modern kind that deflates when you look at it wrong, but the medieval kind. The bread so dense, so nutritious, and so brutally honest, it could double as a weapon and a meal. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that cozy background hum, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. To understand why medieval bread was basically the Avengers of nutrition, you have to understand one simple truth. Medieval people did not eat bread. They entered long-term, committed relationships with it. Bread wasn't food. Bread was identity. If you travelled back in time and asked a medieval peasant, "What's your favourite meal?" they'd answer bread. If you asked, "What's your least favourite meal?" they'd say, "Bread, but older." This stuff made up as much as 70% of a peasant's calories. Today, that would be considered a cry for help. Back then, it was Tuesday. Breakfast, bread, lunch, more bread, dinner. Bread dipped in something vaguely liquid, possibly broth, possibly water that had simply given up. And dessert? A smaller piece of bread you pretended was special, but here's the twist. This wasn't sad. Medieval bread was actually good. Dense, filling, packed with nutrients, and heavy enough to qualify legally as a blunt weapon. A single loaf could power a farmer through ploughing fields, tending livestock, repairing roofs, walking 10 miles uphill in the snow, and defending the village from a man named Ulrich the sheep thief. Modern bread can barely power you through checking emails. Bread was universal. Peasants ate it. Nobles ate it. Monks ate it while pretending they weren't thinking about ale. Even soldiers carried hardtack, a form of bread so durable it could survive a war, a flood, and probably a small meteor strike. Of course, not all bread was created equal. Nobles enjoyed soft, fluffy white loaves that were basically medieval croissants. Peasants, on the other hand, ate bread so dense it violated several laws of physics. But regardless of texture, from angelic cloud to compressed misery, bread was everywhere. The wildest part? Medieval people accidentally created a superfood. They didn't have nutritionists, dietitians, or wellness influencers telling them about gut health. Their priorities were simple. Will this keep me alive? Will this survive winter? Can I eat this without my family questioning my judgment? Bread answered yes to all three. It was easy to store, easy to transport, hard to mess up, and nearly impossible to poison yourself with. A rare accomplishment in medieval cuisine. Compared to the alternative medieval menu, spoiled meat, vegetables that only grew once a year, and water that might murder you, bread was the dependable friend everyone clung to. It wasn't just food. It was survival. It was strategy. It was medieval life, baked into a loaf. To understand why medieval bread acted like a nutritional cheat code, you need to look at the flour. Because medieval flour wasn't the soft, pale, fluffy powder you find in modern grocery stores. The stuff's so over-processed, it practically files your taxes for you. No. Medieval flour was stone-ground, rugged, unfiltered, and nutritionally aggressive. It didn't just sit in your bread, it participated. Stone grinding meant that everything in the grain was pulverized together. The bran, the germ, the endosperm, the minerals, and anything else the millstone felt like including. The result was a flour so full of vitamins, fibre, and natural oils that modern dietitians would weep tears of joy, while modern influencers would immediately try to turn it into an overpriced detox cleanse. Compared to medieval flour, modern flour is, well, sad. Modern flour is stripped, bleached, enriched, and then treated like it needs witness protection. After removing almost everything nutritious, companies add back synthetic vitamins and proudly announce it's fortified. That's like burning down your house and then bragging that you installed a new doorknob. Medieval flour, on the other hand, was whole in every sense of the word. Because stone mills don't discriminate, they grind everything whether it likes it or not. This meant medieval bread contained fibre for digestion, iron for strength, magnesium for muscle function, zinc for immunity, healthy fats for energy, and tiny pieces of rock dust for character. Yes, technically, medieval people ate trace amounts of stone, but that just meant their bread came with bonus minerals and a mild crunchy surprise. That's what you call value, and because it was whole grain, medieval bread actually filled you up. Not filled you up until your next craving hits. No, this was filled you up until the sun sets and your neighbour borrows your ox kind of full. Peasants could work long days because their bread was giving them real sustained energy, not the sugar-fueled emotional roller coaster modern bread sends you on. Stone-ground flour also had flavour. Deep, earthy, nutty, ancient flavour. The kind of flavour that whispers, "I existed before your country did." Modern flour tastes like disappointment by comparison. So yes, medieval flour was coarse, it was gritty, it was strong enough to make your jaw muscles file a complaint. But it was real, it was nutritious, and it was one of the reasons medieval bread could rightfully flex on your modern loaf. If you've ever eaten modern bread and felt like it immediately filed a noise complaint inside your intestines, don't worry. The problem isn't you, it's the wheat. Modern wheat has been bred, crossbred, hybridized, genetically encouraged, and aggressively coached like a grain athlete preparing for the Olympics. It grows fast, grows big, and basically screams, "Look how fluffy I can be." Meanwhile, your gut is sitting there asking, "Who is this stranger and why is he inside me?" Medieval people didn't deal with this nonsense. Their wheat wasn't a frankengrain created in a laboratory of agricultural ambition. It was ancient, calm, respectful, the kind of grain that sits quietly in the corner, minds its own business, and doesn't try to gaslight your digestive system. Einkorn spelt Emma. These were the medieval MVPs. Grains so old and wholesome, they probably addressed you as "my child." Ancient grains had lower gluten, more nutrients, and fewer surprises. They didn't puff up dramatically or behave unpredictably. They were steady, reliable, like the medieval equivalent of that one friend who always shows up on time and never brings emotional chaos. Eating these grains didn't trigger bloating, fatigue, or that existential dread that modern bread sometimes instills after 2 bites. Modern wheat, on the other hand, has been bred for one purpose: productivity. It produces enormous yields, enormous loaves, and enormous digestive complaints. This stuff has more gluten than a Renaissance banquet. Medieval people would take one look at a modern sandwich loaf and ask, "Why does it look like it's filled with air and lies?" Ancient grains also grew in soils that didn't know the meaning of mercy. Poor, rocky, unforgiving earth-shaped grain that had backbone, literal backbone. Modern wheat collapses emotionally if it doesn't get perfect irrigation and ideal weather. Medieval wheat grew anywhere, like a stubborn weed with a strong work ethic. And when baked into bread, ancient grains produced loaves with personality. Heavy, hearty, nutritious, and proudly dense enough to double as home security if thrown accurately. These were not soft, fluffy, cloud-like slices. These were edible bricks of strength that told your body, "You're welcome." Medieval people thrived on this stuff. Their guts embraced it. Their bodies ran on it. Their teeth occasionally questioned it, but even they adapted. Modern bread leaves you tired. Medieval bread left you ready to wrestle a goat, plough a field, and still complain about taxes afterward. If you've ever proudly announced, "I bake sourdough now," congratulations. You have successfully recreated what medieval people did out of pure necessity. 0 Instagram posts, and absolutely no emotional support from Pinterest. Medieval bakers didn't choose sourdough because it was rustic or artisanal. They chose it because that was the only option available. Instant yeast did not exist. Packets of active dry yeast did not line medieval market stalls like magical packets of bread optimism. Instead, medieval people relied entirely on wild fermentation, a polite term for nature is in charge, and we hope it's feeling cooperative today. Inside every medieval starter lived a microscopic party of wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria, the original probiotics long before supplement companies convinced people to swallow yogurt-flavoured capsules at 9 in the morning. These microbes feasted on flour and water, multiplied like gossip in a small village. and transformed the dough into something alive, bubbling, and ready to bake. This slow, natural fermentation was a biochemical miracle disguised as a kitchen chore. As the dough sat for hours, or sometimes overnight, the microbes got to work breaking down gluten, reducing bitterness, neutralizing phytic acid, and making nutrients more available. In simple terms, they did the digestive heavy lifting before the bread even entered your mouth. All you had to do was chew it without breaking a tooth. Compare that to modern bread, which often rises in a rushed 45 minutes, pumped full of yeast strains that work faster than a medieval tax collector. There's no relaxation, no microbial spa treatment, no friendly bacteria helping out. Just speed, convenience, and the inevitable digestive consequences of doing everything too quickly, like fast food with a psychology degree. Medieval sourdough wasn't just easier on the stomach, it was actively good for it. The bacteria created lactic acid, which gave the bread a slight tang and helped preserve it naturally. That means medieval loaves didn't mould in a day like modern supermarket bread, which goes stale faster than a political promise. Even better, this fermentation process created bread with a rich, complex flavour, earthy, tangy, slightly sour, and deeply satisfying, like the bread equivalent of a wise old monk who tells good stories and occasionally steals wine. Wild fermentation also meant every village had its own unique bread flavour, shaped by local microbes. Your bread literally tasted like your hometown. Medieval people didn't know what probiotics were, but they ate them daily without needing colourful packaging or a commercial narrated by a woman doing yoga. Their bread was alive, and their gut was grateful. If you've ever eaten modern bread and wondered, why does my stomach feel like it's reenacting a medieval siege? The answer is simple. Modern dough barely has time to wake up before it's shoved into the oven. Today's bread rises in under an hour, sometimes under 20 minutes. That's not fermentation. That's bread speedrunning. It's the culinary equivalent of cramming for an exam and hoping the professor doesn't ask real questions. Medieval dough, however, had time. Long, luxurious spa retreat levels of time. 8, 12, sometimes 20 hours of slow fermenting, bubbling, resting, and contemplating the meaning of life. This was not rushed bread. This was dough that had been spiritually awakened. The science, which medieval people didn't know but benefited from anyway, is beautiful. During long fermentation, natural enzymes and friendly bacteria break down gluten into smaller components. They also digest problematic sugars like fructans that modern guts absolutely despise. Phytic acid, the anti-nutrient that blocks mineral absorption, gets neutralized. Essentially, the dough becomes more and more digestible, more nutritious, and less likely to stage an uprising inside you. In other words, medieval bread was pre-digested. Not in a weird way. In a helpful, your stomach barely has to do anything way. By the time it reached your digestive system, it was practically waving a little flag that said, "Relax, I've already handled it." Modern bread says the opposite. It looks at your intestines and says, "Good luck, champ," then sprints away. You can imagine the difference in how people felt. Medieval peasants weren't sitting around clutching their stomachs after eating bread. They weren't Googling gluten intolerance symptoms. They weren't debating sourdough versus gluten-free diets in candlelit cottages. They ate their bread, went back to ploughing fields, lifting hay bales, and doing 12-hour days of physical labour without collapsing dramatically like a character in a Victorian novel. The long fermentation also improved flavour. Medieval bread tasted complex, sour, nutty, deep, like the kind of bread that sits you down, looks you in the eyes, and tells you the story of how it survived the winter of 1400-something. Modern bread tastes like air. Soft, suspiciously sweet air. And here's the kicker. Long fermentation naturally preserved bread. It stayed fresh for days, weeks if dried. It didn't need preservatives, additives, or ingredients that sound like prescription medication. Medieval bread wasn't just food. It was a chemically balanced, gut-friendly marvel, made by accident and perfected through patience. If medieval bread was a slow, thoughtful, handwritten letter, modern bread is a text message typed in a hurry with autocorrect turned on. It's fast, convenient, widely available, and deeply questionable. The biggest difference between medieval bread and modern bread comes down to one uncomfortable truth. Modern bread is basically fast food wearing a healthy Halloween costume. Let's start with fermentation time, or rather the lack of it. Modern industrial bread doesn't ferment, it rushes. Factories use turbocharged commercial yeast that inflates dough in record time, the way a politician inflates promises during election season. While medieval dough sat around all day relaxing like a monk in silent meditation, modern dough gets maybe 15 minutes before someone screams, "Bake it." This creates bread that's fluffy, yes, but it's fluff built on shortcuts. Like a mattress made of marshmallows, it feels impressive until you realize your spine hates you. Then there are the additives. Medieval bakers used 3 ingredients: flour, water, salt. Modern bread companies see that list and say, "Cute. Here are 27 more for no reason." Emulsifiers, conditioners, bleachers, sweeteners, stabilizers, all working together like a corporate board meeting inside your loaf. Today's bread isn't baked, it's manufactured. It has the vibe of a food item that legally qualifies as bread, but spiritually identifies as packing foam. Consider shelf life. Medieval bread went stale in days because it was real. Modern bread can sit untouched for a week, a month, or possibly until the next ice age without changing shape. That's not bread. That's a science experiment that made it to production. If medieval peasants saw modern sliced bread sitting on your kitchen counter, looking suspiciously youthful, they'd assume dark sorcery. Even the flour is too modern for its own good. Highly refined white flour has been stripped of fibre, nutrients, personality, and any trace of relevance. Companies fortify it with synthetic vitamins, hoping you won't notice they removed all the real ones first. It's like stealing your wallet and then handing you a coupon as an apology. And don't even get started on the hidden sugar. Modern bread is weirdly sweet, like it's trying to trick your body into thinking it's dessert. Medieval bakers would take one bite and say, "Why does this taste like someone panicked halfway through the recipe?" When you add everything together, the speed, the additives, the engineered sweetness, the artificial softness, you end up with something that resembles bread, but behaves more like an edible imposter. Modern bread fills your stomach. Medieval bread fueled your existence. One of the great joys of researching medieval bread is discovering that it contained exactly 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt. That's it. End of list. No footnotes, no chemistry exam, no fine print warning you about allergens, stabilizers, conditioners, or ingredients that sound like they were invented in a villain's laboratory. Medieval bakers kept things simple because, frankly, they didn't have much else to work with, and the bread was better for it. Now compare that to a modern loaf from the supermarket. If you flip it over and read the ingredient label, you will find a paragraph, not a list, a paragraph, of mysterious substances that would make a medieval monk clutch his rosary in horror. You get things like calcium propionate, ascorbic acid, monoglycerides, DATEM, azodicarbonamide, which, by the way, is also used in yoga mats. Yes. There is a non-zero chance your bread and your gym floor share an ingredient. Medieval peasants may have been cold, muddy, and smelling faintly of livestock, but at least their bread wasn't made of exercise equipment. These additives are included for a reason, of course. They make bread softer, springier, sweeter, lighter, taller, more obedient, more shelf-stable, and less likely to collapse emotionally under pressure. Industrial bread companies treat dough like a badly behaved pet that needs training. Sit, stay, don't mold, don't sag, don't crumble. Also, be fluffy. And then they're surprised when your digestive system quits its job. Medieval dough didn't get pampered with conditioners or preservatives. It rose naturally, shaped itself humbly, baked honestly, and went stale like a respectable food should. There's something suspicious about a loaf that refuses to age. Medieval people would look at a 2-week-old fresh modern loaf and immediately suspect demonic involvement. And then there's the bleaching. Modern bread flour is often whitened chemically because apparently people lost the psychological ability to eat beige food. Medieval bakers would stare at modern white bread the same way you stare at a cat wearing a little sweater, confused, slightly disturbed, and unsure who allowed this. It's not just the ingredients, it's the philosophy. Medieval bread was food. Modern bread is a product. One nourished entire populations. The other tries very hard to imitate bread while containing as little real bread as legally possible. Your modern loaf isn't trying to poison you. It's just built for appearance, convenience, and shelf life, not human biology. Medieval bread didn't have ingredients you couldn't pronounce. Modern bread sometimes has ingredients scientists struggle to explain. If you've ever eaten a slice of modern bread and felt like your bloodstream immediately turned into a sugary theme park ride, congratulations, you've experienced the glycemic roller coaster. Modern bread hits your blood sugar so fast, your pancreas has to file a complaint. The energy spike is dramatic, chaotic, and short-lived, followed by a crash so hard you start questioning your life choices. Medieval bread didn't do this. Medieval bread was slow, steady, and sensible. The bread version of a responsible adult wearing practical shoes. Thanks to whole grains, fibre, long fermentation, and minimal processing, medieval bread digested gradually. Energy was released over time, not dumped into your system like a bucket of glucose confetti. Picture a medieval peasant eating bread in the morning. They didn't get a sugar rush. They didn't get a crash. They didn't get hangry at 11 o'clock and threaten violence over a missing snack. They got stable, sustained energy that powered them through ploughing fields, harvesting crops, hauling firewood, and other impressive feats of physical labour that would send modern office workers directly to HR. This wasn't magic. It was simply chemistry that hadn't been messed with yet. The bran and germ in medieval flour acted like natural speed bumps, slowing digestion and flattening the glucose curve. Fibre forced the body to take its time. Fermentation broke down sugars before the bread even touched your tongue. The result? A loaf that treated your bloodstream like a calm, polite guest. Modern bread, however, comes at your body like a medieval battering ram. The refined flour contains almost no fibre, meaning the glucose hits your bloodstream with all the subtlety of a cat knocking things off a shelf. Breakfast becomes a sprint, followed by a slump, followed by caffeine, followed by regret. Medieval peasants didn't know what glycemic index was. They didn't have charts, nutritionists, or influencers shouting at them through ring lights. They just knew that after eating their bread, they could work without collapsing dramatically on the barn floor. The difference is obvious. Medieval bread supported your metabolism. Modern bread tries to hijack it, and the consequences show. Today, millions struggle with blood sugar spikes, energy crashes, insulin resistance, and cravings created by foods designed for profit, not physiology. Medieval bread nourished. Modern bread negotiates with your bloodstream like a shady merchant selling questionable potions. In the great battle of glucose control, medieval bread remains undefeated. Here's the funniest part about medieval bread. Medieval people had no idea why it worked so well. They didn't know what gut bacteria were. They didn't know about microbiomes, digestive enzymes, or probiotics. They didn't even wash their hands consistently. But somehow, their bread was a daily gift to their digestive system. Total accident, zero research, no health gurus. Just microbes doing their thing while peasants tried not to starve. The secret? Wild fermentation. Every medieval sourdough starter was a tiny civilization of bacteria and yeast, bubbling away like it was paying rent. These cultures weren't sterilized or purified. They were alive, chaotic, and surprisingly friendly to the human gut. When medieval people ate their bread, they were eating living organisms that helped break down food, regulate digestion, and keep harmful bacteria in check. They weren't eating probiotics. They were eating actual life, sprinkled on top of centuries-old milling techniques. Modern bread, in comparison, is sterile, deactivated, comically lifeless. Most supermarket loaves have the microbial diversity of a desert rock. Your gut looks at modern bread and says, okay, but where's the team? Instead of delivering beneficial bacteria, modern bread offers little more than empty starch and a 2 p.m. energy crash. Medieval bread also carried beneficial acids produced during fermentation, lactic acid, acetic acid, and other compounds that gently lowered stomach pH and encouraged good digestion. These acids slowed carbohydrate absorption and supported healthy gut flora. Medieval people didn't know any of this. They just knew their bread didn't give them stomach cramps and existential dread. And let's talk fibre. Medieval bread was loaded with it. Stone-ground flour didn't remove the bran or germ, meaning every bite delivered a high-fibre punch directly to the intestines. Modern bread? It has so little fibre it should legally be classified as a decorative sponge. Fibre fed the good bacteria, kept digestion regular, and gave medieval guts a robust resilience. Modern microbiomes can only dream about. Even mould, yes, mould, behaved differently. Medieval bread staled naturally. When it finally moulded, it grew harmless. Natural moulds, not the toxic industrial kind that develops on preservatives-packed loaves today. Medieval people simply dried stale bread into rusks, or soaked it in broth until it became edible again. Waste not, want not, especially when your bread is busier improving your gut health than your doctor is. So yes, medieval bread was messy, rustic, and occasionally crunchy in places you didn't expect. But your gut loved it. Modern bread? Your gut tolerates it. The same way medieval peasants tolerated winter. If you've ever wondered how medieval people managed to haul stones, swing axes, carry livestock, climb battlements, dig trenches, thresh grain, farm fields, fight wars, and walk everywhere without collapsing like dehydrated houseplants, the answer is surprisingly simple. Bread. Not modern bread, that would have knocked them out by lunchtime, but medieval bread, the nutritional equivalent of powering your body with a slow-burning furnace instead of a birthday candle. Medieval peasants were not nibbling delicate croissants or artisanal brioche. They were consuming dense, whole-grain loaves that weighed roughly as much as a modern dumbbell. One slice could keep you full for hours. 2 slices could power you through an entire day of manual labour. 3 slices, and you were basically invincible, unless the local lord raised taxes again. Bread was engineered by nature and accident, not factories. It delivered complex carbohydrates, the kind that release energy slowly and consistently, not the kind that send your blood sugar into orbit before dropping you into a mid-morning coma. Combined with all those minerals, healthy fats from the grain germ, fermentation-enhanced nutrients, and fibre, medieval bread was a complete meal disguised as a loaf. This meant medieval bodies were conditioned on a steady flow of real energy. Peasants didn't deal with the afternoon crash where you stare at your laptop begging for mercy. They weren't snacking every hour. They weren't craving pastries or frappuccinos or anything sprinkled with cinnamon and regret. Their diet kept them moving because it was designed, unintentionally, for endurance. Even monks, who spent large parts of the day in quiet contemplation, or napping, depending on the monastery, ate bread as a core sustenance. Monastic bread could be shockingly austere, but it still packed enough nutrients to sustain long hours of prayer, writing, gardening, and illuminating manuscripts with angels who looked suspiciously disappointed. Soldiers, meanwhile, lived practically on bread. Armies marched on loaves that provided the caloric density needed to walk 30 miles in armour while carrying weapons heavy enough to ruin your posture for the rest of your life. Bread was so essential to the medieval body that shortages led not only to hunger, but to literal uprisings. If you think modern people get cranky without carbs, medieval people started revolutions. It wasn't just food, it was physical fuel. It built muscle, restored energy, and kept people alive when winters were cruel and protein was rare. Medieval bread didn't pamper you, it prepared you. Modern bread makes you tired. Medieval bread made you dangerous. Bread may have been the star of the medieval menu, but it didn't perform alone. It had a supporting cast, a humble, sometimes questionable, but surprisingly effective ensemble that turned bread from basic carbohydrate into nutritional powerhouse. Medieval people weren't pairing their bread with ultra-processed deli meat or flavoured spreads with ingredient lists that look like cryptic spells. No, They ate bread the way nature intended, with simple foods that actually made sense. Take cheese, for instance. Medieval cheese wasn't the fluorescent, rubbery block you find in modern discount stores. It was real cheese, aged, tangy, dense, and powerful enough to knock you backwards if you weren't prepared. It delivered protein, fat, and calories. Paired with whole grain, fermented bread, it created a nutrient combo strong enough to let a peasant walk 15 miles before breakfast without complaining. Modern people whine when the Wi-Fi goes out for 10 minutes. Then there was broth. Medieval broth wasn't the delicate, low-sodium liquid health influencers sip during fasts. It was whatever liquid you got from boiling bones, vegetables, herbs, or anything else not nailed down. It was fatty, savoury, and often the only hot thing on the menu during winter. Bread dipped into medieval broth softened into a nutritious, warm porridge-like meal that filled stomachs and revived spirits. It was the medieval version of comfort food, minus all the existential guilt. Beans were another common partner. Rich in protein and fibre, beans made bread even more effective as a daily staple. Together, they formed a nutritional duo so successful that entire populations survived off them. Imagine telling a medieval peasant that modern humans voluntarily avoid carbs and legumes. They would assume you'd been cursed. Even ale played a role. Yes, ale. Not the modern, ultra-hopped liquid bragging contest, but low-alcohol, nutrient-rich medieval ale made from barley and yeast. It was safer to drink than water, provided calories and paired with bread so naturally that monks practically wrote hymns about it. Bread plus ale was the medieval equivalent of peanut butter plus jelly, except it kept you alive and mildly buzzed. And let's not forget onions, herbs, and whatever seasonal vegetables managed to survive the climate. These simple additions created a balanced diet that complemented bread's strengths. Nothing flashy, nothing artificial, just honest food doing honest work. Medieval bread thrived because it wasn't fighting against processed meats, sugary spreads, or preservatives. It was part of a system, a simple, unprocessed, beautifully accidental nutritional symphony. Bread wasn't a lonely hero, it was the leader of a well-trained medieval food squad. One of the biggest reasons medieval bread was so good, nutritionally, digestively, spiritually, is that making it was an absolute ordeal. Nothing in medieval baking was quick, easy, convenient, or designed for people who valued free time. There were no bread machines, no stand mixers, no pre-milled flour in cute paper bags. Bread was a process, a lifestyle, a commitment rivaled only by marriage and seasonal plague survival. First, you had to mill the grain. This meant dragging sacks of wheat to a mill that was usually owned by a lord who charged you for the privilege of using his millstones. Stones that were older than civilization and probably haunted. Milling wasn't optional. You couldn't cheat. If you tried to grind grain at home, the lord would fine you, scold you, or send someone to confiscate your quernstone like a medieval repo man. So peasants trudged to the mill, waited in line, paid their fee, and watched as the grain turned into coarse, nutritious flour whether it wanted to or not. Then came kneading, by hand for long periods, using muscles most modern people didn't know they had. Medieval dough wasn't soft or gentle, it fought back. Making bread was essentially arm day at the gym, except the gym didn't exist and your only reward was not starving. Next, you had to tend the sourdough starter. This living, bubbling creature demanded constant attention. Feed it, stir it, whisper encouragement. Accidentally neglect it for a week, and it turned into something that could legally be classified as an enemy. But when treated correctly, it rewarded bakers with beautifully fermented dough that tasted like ancient wisdom and mild acidity. After mixing came the long fermentation, hours and hours of waiting, while the dough slowly transformed. Modern people call this slow living. Medieval people called it, well, we don't have a choice. And finally, the baking. Heating an oven with actual firewood, scraping embers aside, placing the dough carefully on the hot stones, praying it didn't burn, collapse, or get stolen by a dog. All this effort meant something important. No one cut corners. Not because they were morally superior, but because shortcuts didn't exist. Every step, from milling to kneading to fermenting to baking, created bread that was dense, flavourful, mineral-rich, and naturally probiotic. Modern bread is fast because it can be. Medieval bread was exceptional because it had to be. When your survival depends on a loaf, you tend to make it properly. If medieval bread feels like a superfood, and modern bread feels like a digestive prank, the real culprit is the wheat itself. Today's wheat is not the charming, wholesome, slightly awkward grain your ancestors knew. No, modern wheat is the overachiever of the agricultural world, selectively bred to be taller, faster, stronger, fluffier, and dramatically more clingy in the gluten department. It's wheat on performance enhancers, and your gut is the one paying the price. Ancient wheat varieties like einkorn, spelt, and emmer had simple personalities. They grew modestly. They behaved predictably. They didn't try to dominate every field like botanical tyrants. Their gluten structure was mild and manageable, strong enough to make bread rise, but not so aggressive that your intestines needed therapy afterward. Medieval farmers planted these grains because that's what the earth allowed. They weren't obsessed with yield or efficiency. They were just trying not to starve. Enter modern wheat. Over the last century, scientists, with good intentions to be fair, engineered wheat that could survive harsh climates, produce enormous quantities, resist pests, and create soft, fluffy loaves that make consumers emotional. In doing so, they unintentionally created a grain that is practically a stranger to the human digestive system. Modern wheat contains significantly more gluten than medieval varieties because gluten makes bread soft, stretchy, and Instagrammable. Unfortunately, it also makes many stomachs angry, confused, or both. But gluten isn't the only issue. Modern wheat has fewer micronutrients because industrial farming strips the soil of minerals faster than medieval peasants stripped fields of weeds. The grain grows faster but absorbs less. It looks impressive, but like many things that look impressive, it's nutritionally shy. Medieval wheat might have been smaller and scrappier, but it packed a genuine mineral punch. Modern milling makes things worse. Even if wheat starts with nutrients, most are removed during refinement. Then companies sprinkle synthetic vitamins back in and proudly call the flour enriched, as though that cancels out the crime scene. When medieval people ate bread, their bodies recognized it instantly. Ah yes, the gut said, food. When you eat modern bread, your gut reacts like it just received an unexpected email. Suspicious, stressed, and already regretting opening it. Modern wheat is not evil. It's just too modern for its own good. It was designed for mass production, not human physiology. Medieval wheat was designed by nature, chance, and 1,000 years of farmers who had no idea they were growing the perfect carb. Your ancestors didn't avoid gluten. Gluten avoided them. One of the biggest differences between medieval bread and modern bread is simple. Medieval bread knew where it came from. It had roots, a personality, a sense of place. Modern bread has a distribution centre. Medieval bread was a village product, shaped by local soil, weather, grain variety, fermentation style, oven type, and the general mood of the baker that day. Modern bread is shaped by conveyor belts and corporate efficiency metrics. Let's start with seasonality. Medieval people didn't bake with whatever is in stock. Their bread depended entirely on the harvest cycle. Wheat came in once a year, and if the crop failed, congratulations. You were eating rye, oats, barley, or whatever grain hadn't offended the weather gods. This meant medieval bread reflected the land's natural rhythm. It wasn't consistent, but it was real. Each loaf was a tiny autobiography of that year's soil conditions. Rainy spring, mild summer, slightly chaotic harvest. Because grain was precious, nothing travelled far. Flour didn't come from across the country. It came from fields a few miles away, fields you could point to, complain about, and occasionally curse when the yield looked disappointing. Your bread wasn't built from anonymous, industrially blended wheat designed to create identical loaves from Delhi to Detroit. It tasted like your region because it was your region. Then there's honesty. Medieval bread didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. If it was dense, it owned it. If it was sour, it embraced it. If it had a crack running down the centre because the oven was slightly too hot, no one panicked or launched a rebranding campaign. There were no preservatives, no conditioners, no ingredients that sounded like pharmaceutical disclaimers. If bread went stale, that was normal. If mould grew, it wasn't neon green or suspiciously fluffy. It was regular, boring mould, the kind that medieval people simply scraped off or turned into trenchers or ale-soaked mush. Waste? Unthinkable. Modern bread, by contrast, is built for longevity, uniformity, softness, and emotional manipulation. It's designed to survive shipping, storage, marketing, and customer expectations. It must be fluffy, compliant, and morally unproblematic for an unnaturally long time. To achieve this, modern bread is fortified, stabilized, bleached, sweetened, and digitally packaged until it barely resembles its ancestors. But medieval bread? It was transparent, local, seasonal, honest. It lived and died within the rhythm of the village, and your body understood that. It recognized the microbes, the minerals, the grain varieties, all of it. Medieval bread didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be real. In the end, the difference between medieval bread and modern bread comes down to one brutal truth. Medieval bread knew exactly what it was, and modern bread is still trying to figure that out. Medieval bread was simple, direct, honest, the nutritional equivalent of a blunt, hard-working farmer who rises before dawn, lifts boulders for fun, and speaks in complete, emotionally stable sentences. Modern bread, meanwhile, is like a confused intern who keeps adding unnecessary ingredients to prove it belongs in the meeting. Medieval bread nourished entire populations. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't soft. It didn't arrive in cheerful plastic packaging with health claims printed in bright fonts. It just fed people, efficiently, thoroughly, and without triggering gastrointestinal fireworks. Every ingredient worked with the body. Whole grains, natural enzymes, wild microbes, long fermentation, and mineral-rich flour gave medieval guts exactly what they needed, even if nobody understood the science behind it. Modern bread, on the other hand, has become a master of disguise. It looks friendly. It smells comforting. It slices beautifully. But inside, it contains refined flours stripped of nutrients, additives designed to keep loaves soft longer than medieval kingdoms lasted, and gluten structures engineered for volume rather than digestion. Your stomach tastes the loaf, pauses politely, then whispers, "What? What exactly am I supposed to do with this?" Medieval peasants never asked whether bread was good for them. They didn't worry about insulin spikes. They didn't debate gluten sensitivity. They didn't need TikTok nutritionists shouting advice at them through ring lights. Bread worked so well that they based their entire diet on it. Bread kept them strong enough to farm, build, carry, fight, and survive winters that would make modern humans curl into a ball on the kitchen floor. Modern bread, meanwhile, frequently makes people bloated, tired, foggy, or irritable, as if the loaf is personally offended you chose to eat it. Medieval bread was a partner in survival. Modern bread behaves more like a well-meaning but deeply incompetent roommate. This doesn't mean bread has betrayed us entirely. Real sourdough, whole grains, and traditional milling can still create loaves that resemble their medieval ancestors, nutritious, digestible, flavorful, and free from yoga mat ingredients. The knowledge hasn't vanished. It's just been buried under convenience and industrial shortcuts. The truth is simple. Medieval bread wasn't a superfood because they intended it to be. It was a superfood because it was real. No shortcuts, no preservatives, no existential confusion, just grain, water, salt, and 1,000 years of tradition holding everything together. Cleopatra VII did not arrive into a peaceful kingdom that welcomed her with trumpets and lotus petals. She was born in 69 BCE into the notoriously dysfunctional Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal family so famous for infighting that the safest place to be was probably outside the palace. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known to his critics as the flute player, because apparently ruling Egypt was not dramatic enough without adding musical hobbies, spent more time bankrupting Egypt than governing it. And yet, he adored Greek culture, distrusted nearly everyone, and owed so much money to Rome that he might as well have placed a for sale sign on the great library. From the moment she could walk, Cleopatra grew up surrounded by marble halls that echoed with secrets, half-whispered betrayals, and diplomatic panic. Alexandria, her home, was dazzling. The lighthouse towered over the harbour, scholars argued inside the library, and merchants from Africa, Greece, and the Near East filled the streets with colour and noise. But behind all that brilliance, the palace itself was a snake pit, sometimes literally, depending on which sibling had access to venom that day. What separated Cleopatra from the rest of her family was her mind. While other royals were content being decorative, Cleopatra studied. She listened. She learned Egyptian, something no Ptolemy before her had bothered to do, which already made her more connected to her subjects than any co-ruler in a century. She pushed herself through philosophy, mathematics, politics, and languages. By her teenage years, she could converse in 9 tongues, meaning she could charm foreign envoys, interrogate traitors, and shut down arguments without needing a translator to soften her insults. But her early years were shaped by more than education. Egypt was weakening. Famine loomed. Rome's shadow stretched across the Mediterranean, and Ptolemy XII was so desperate to stay on Egypt's throne that he practically begged Rome for protection. Every favour he requested came with a Roman price tag: a heavier tax, a new debt, another political humiliation. Cleopatra watched her father bend, bargain, and occasionally run for his life. And so, long before she wore a crown, Cleopatra learned a truth that defined her legend. Egypt would survive only if its ruler could outthink every rival. Even as a child, she understood her future would demand cunning, not comfort. By the time Cleopatra VII entered her early teens, she had already mastered the most essential skill for any Ptolemaic royal: staying alive long enough to reach adulthood. The palace at Alexandria might have looked serene from the outside: gleaming columns, libraries, incense drifting through sunlit courtyards. But inside it operated with the energy of a shark tank disguised as a family reunion. Every sibling was a potential rival, every advisor had a hidden agenda, and every banquet could, in theory, be your last. Cleopatra learned to read a room the way other teenagers read gossip scrolls. Her siblings, especially, were less family and more future problems. The Ptolemies had a proud tradition of sibling rivalry, usually ending with poison, daggers, or someone mysteriously drowning in the Nile after a relaxing evening boat ride. Cleopatra understood this history well, not because she read it in a textbook, but because the adults around her constantly reenacted it. And so she adapted. She learned when to speak boldly and when to remain silent. She learned which servants were loyal, which eunuchs carried information, and which corridors echoed with the footsteps of people she should avoid. Her primary competitor was her father's favoured child, her brother, Ptolemy XIII. Younger than her, pampered, and surrounded by tutors who convinced him the universe orbited around his golden sandals, he grew up believing leadership was his birthright. Cleopatra, on the other hand, was raised on observation, study, and strategy. While he practiced royal strutting, she practiced statecraft. But Cleopatra's greatest challenge wasn't her siblings. It was Egypt's collapsing stability. The economy strained under debt. Rome's influence grew heavier by the month. Grain shortages sparked unrest. Her father's ministers scrambled to keep the kingdom from fracturing, and Cleopatra watched every moment from behind carved doors and curtain veils. She saw how quickly alliances shifted, how bribes worked better than laws, and how a king's authority depended less on divine right and more on political agility. These years forged her instincts. When a diplomat flattered too easily, she recognized manipulation. When a noble hesitated, she detected fear. When her father exiled opponents, She studied the reasons and the consequences. The palace was her school, and its chaos her curriculum. By the time she reached 14, Cleopatra wasn't just a daughter of the king. She was a contestant in a dangerous game where the prize was Egypt, and the penalty for losing was annihilation. Cleopatra VII's teenage years coincided with one of the worst crises Egypt had faced in generations, a devastating famine triggered by the Nile's failure to flood. For most ancient civilizations, drought was bad. For Egypt, whose entire agricultural system depended on the river's annual rise, it was catastrophic. Grain fields shriveled, hunger spread, and food prices soared so high that even aristocrats began hoarding like anxious squirrels. And all of this unfolded while Cleopatra was barely old enough to vote in a modern student council. For a princess in her mid-teens, this was not just a natural disaster. It was political training in disguise. She watched how quickly order dissolved when food disappeared. Crowds gathered outside palaces demanding grain. Merchants were accused of price gouging. Temples struggled to perform rituals because offerings were scarce. Everything from public morale to the monarchy's legitimacy hung by a thread woven from whatever harvest survived. While Ptolemy XII panicked, blamed officials, and sent desperate messages to Rome asking for assistance, and presumably forgiveness for the previous assistance he already owed them money for, Cleopatra paid attention to the mechanics of survival. She studied the grain reserves, the trade routes, and the laws regulating bread distribution. She learned which cities could still import grain from abroad and which regions were buckling under starvation. Instead of retreating into luxury, she observed the suffering of ordinary Egyptians and the failings of her dynasty. This disaster taught Cleopatra something profound. The monarchy could not simply rely on divine titles or ancient rituals. A ruler had to act, adapt, and, when necessary, outmaneuver the chaos the gods sent. More importantly, she realized that Egypt's stability was fragile. All it took was one failed flood, one bad political decision, or one Roman intervention for the kingdom to collapse. The famine also hardened the emotional steel she would later wield as queen. Where another princess might have fainted or complained about grain shortages ruining palace feasts, Cleopatra sharpened her resolve. She saw how easily people turned on the throne when their children starved. She witnessed riots, heard rumors of rebellion, and understood the razor-thin line separating loyalty from revolt. These teenage lessons were not abstract. They became the foundation of her future rule. Long before she met Julius Caesar or commanded fleets, Cleopatra learned that a queen survives not through beauty or charm, but by confronting catastrophe with intelligence and unshakable control. By Cleopatra, the seventh's mid-teens, one truth became painfully obvious. Egypt was no longer the master of its fate. Rome, ambitious, hungry, and inconveniently obsessed with Mediterranean domination, hovered over the kingdom like a vulture waiting for something to die. And unfortunately for Cleopatra's family, Ptolemy XII had a habit of making himself look deliciously vulnerable. Years before, he had secured his throne by charming Roman senators, emptying Egypt's treasury, and offering bribes so extravagant they could have funded their own minor empire. But Rome never did favours out of kindness. Every coin they accepted became a chain. By Cleopatra's teenage years, those chains were tight. Roman tax collectors roamed Egyptian ports. Roman envoys strutted through the palace with the confidence of men who believed they owned the place. Even Rome's internal politics affected Alexandria, as if Egypt were an extension of the Senate's lunchroom drama. Cleopatra watched this carefully. She memorized which Roman families held influence, which generals commanded loyalty, and which political factions were rising or collapsing. Her intelligence was her greatest asset, and unlike her father, she understood that Rome's power was not something you begged. It was something you negotiated. She realized that survival in this new world meant speaking Rome's language, understanding its ambitions, and when needed, outsmarting it without ever appearing to defy it. And yet Rome's presence didn't just shape diplomacy, it reshaped Egypt's internal politics. Any noble hoping to dethrone the king went running to Roman patrons. Every palace argument included at least one threat disguised as a friendly word from Rome. Cleopatra's siblings grew up believing Rome was a kind of divine force, part oracle, part bully, part distant father figure, who could grant or destroy kingdoms depending on his mood. For Cleopatra, this looming foreign influence was both a danger and an opportunity. While other royals feared Rome as a monstrous giant, she viewed it as a puzzle, one with moving pieces, hidden motives, and men whose egos were large enough to be weaponized. She understood that if Egypt was to remain independent, its ruler would need a sharper mind than any senator and more persuasive charm than any diplomat. These observations planted the seeds of her future alliances, strategies, and legendary partnerships. Long before she captivated Roman generals, Cleopatra learned how Rome thought, how it operated, and how it could be bent, not defeated but guided, by a ruler cunning enough to do it. Cleopatra VII was still a teenager when her world imploded spectacularly, because her father, Ptolemy XII, managed to anger nearly everyone simultaneously. Egyptian nobles despised him for draining the treasury. The populace hated him for famine and taxes. Even the priests, usually experts at pretending to like whoever sat on the throne, had run out of polite excuses. Eventually, Egypt did what Egypt always did when a Ptolemy misbehaved. It rebelled. The result? Ptolemy XII was forced into exile, fleeing to Rome to beg for help. Cleopatra, not yet queen and barely old enough to lead her own household, suddenly found herself watching her dynasty teeter like a drunk acrobat on a tightrope. Her older sister, Berenice IV, seized power in their father's absence, styling herself queen, and behaving with all the subtlety of someone who wanted the history books to remember her as the sister who caused the most chaos. For Cleopatra, this wasn't just political drama. It was a masterclass in what not to do as a ruler. While Berenice IV tried to legitimize her reign through force and spectacle, Cleopatra studied the consequences. She observed how nobles shifted allegiance, how foreign envoys reacted, and how quickly the people embraced any ruler who promised stability regardless of competence. Teenagers usually learn life lessons like don't trust everyone or don't overshare. Cleopatra learned how to survive a coup. During this period, she also learned the brutal mechanics of exile. Though she remained in Egypt while her father grovelled in Rome, she experienced firsthand the instability of being part of a dynasty that could evaporate overnight. Every letter from abroad carried rumours. Would Rome restore Ptolemy XII? Would they annex Egypt? Would Berenice IV execute her siblings? Cleopatra lived suspended between hope, fear, and strategy, but chaos did not crush her. It clarified her purpose. This was the moment she understood that royalty was not protection. It was a target. She realized that if she ever reached the throne, she would need Roman support, Egyptian loyalty, and enough intelligence to outplay both sides without losing herself in the process. These teenage years of upheaval shaped her into something the ancient world rarely saw, a royal who learned from disaster instead of repeating it. Cleopatra stepped out of this family storm not weakened, but sharpened. Ready for the throne, fate was already steering toward her. When Cleopatra VII was around 15 or 16, the political tides abruptly shifted. Ptolemy XII, after spending his exile wandering Rome with the desperation of a man trying to return a very overdue library book, finally convinced the Romans to restore him to Egypt's throne. Of course, convince is a generous term. He essentially paid Julius Caesar and Pompey enough gold to make an entire Senate shrug and say, "Fine, go get your kingdom back." Rome sent troops. Berenice IV resisted, and the result was violent, decisive, and tragic. Berenice was executed, and the flute-player king returned home shaking but victorious. Cleopatra watched this entire restoration from the inside, and it taught her more about realpolitik than any tutor ever could. She saw firsthand that Rome did not act out of loyalty or ideology, it acted out of profit. She saw how quickly soldiers could alter a nation's fate, and she saw how fragile royal legitimacy was. One moment her sister ruled with ambition, The next, her name was erased from every inscription. But Cleopatra also gained something during this return: opportunity. Ptolemy XII owed Rome more money than he could ever repay, and needed absolute control over Egypt to keep the debts flowing. That meant he needed someone clever by his side, someone who understood politics, someone he could trust more than his remaining children, who, in fairness, did not have a great track record of loyalty. Cleopatra became that person. Teenage Cleopatra began attending councils, listening to petitions, and observing administrative decisions. Her father, exhausted from crisis and aging faster than his cosmetics could disguise, increasingly relied on her judgment. She learned how to assess grain shipments, evaluate legal disputes, and handle tax negotiations with regions already strained by famine. This was not ceremonial involvement. This was training for rulership. Alexandria's court also noticed. Officials whispered about the young princess who asked sharper questions than men twice her age. Foreign envoys reported that she was articulate, confident, and perceptive. Even Roman observers noted her intelligence long before they took an interest in her beauty. The restoration was brutal, costly, and politically humiliating for Egypt, but for Cleopatra it marked her ascent from royal daughter to political actor. She stepped out of the shadow of her siblings and into the machinery of power, readying herself for the throne she would soon share, then dominate. By the time Cleopatra VII reached 17, she was no longer just a princess observing politics from the sidelines. She was a force quietly shaping them. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was physically weakening and politically exhausted. Years of exile, debt, famine, and rebellion had drained him, leaving a kingdom held together by Roman intimidation and Cleopatra's growing competence. While her brother Ptolemy XIII was being groomed in name only for future kingship, Cleopatra was being groomed in reality. Her education intensified. She continued mastering languages, Egyptian, Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and others, because influence often depended on speaking to someone in their own tongue. She studied medicine to understand the rituals of healing. She studied rhetoric to sway advisors and generals. She studied philosophy to strengthen her own resolve. The result was a teenage royal with the intellectual arsenal of a seasoned statesman. But Cleopatra's training extended beyond the classroom. She accompanied tax inspectors, observed legal hearings, and met foreign envoys. She learned how to greet Nubian diplomats with warmth, Syrian governors with courtesy, and Roman envoys with tactical flattery. Her presence alone signaled stability, something Egypt desperately needed. Meanwhile, the court around her simmered with tension. Every noble sensed that Ptolemy XII would not live many more years. Ambitious ministers whispered about which child would succeed him. Cleopatra felt the pressure too. She knew her brother's advisors, especially the scheming eunuch Pothinus, were already maneuvering to control him once he became king. She also understood that Rome expected Egypt to be ruled by someone compliant, indebted, and easy to manipulate. Cleopatra was none of those things, so she prepared. She forged alliances with priests, knowing their support gave legitimacy. She solidified relationships with key generals, offering them trust where her father had offered suspicion. She studied Egypt's economy so thoroughly that she could predict which provinces would rebel under tax pressure. And she took careful note of popular opinion, understanding that people who had lived through famine and political turmoil longed for a ruler who seemed competent and decisive. Her late teenage years became a crucible. Every crisis she witnessed carved away weakness. Every diplomatic conversation sharpened her instincts. Every glimpse of palace scheming reminded her that survival depended on staying 3 moves ahead. By 17, Cleopatra was no longer just preparing for the throne, she was preparing to defend it. Because once her father died, she knew the real struggle would begin. When Cleopatra VII was about 17, the moment she had been preparing for, dreading, calculating toward, and silently rehearsing, finally arrived. Ptolemy XII died. His reign had been a spectacular combination of debt, desperation, and diplomatic begging. but he left behind one undeniable legacy. He ensured Cleopatra would not face her fate alone. In his will, he named Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as joint rulers of Egypt. A teenage girl and an even younger boy were now expected to steer one of the most important kingdoms in the Mediterranean. What could possibly go wrong? For Cleopatra, the announcement was both liberating and terrifying. She finally had the authority she had trained for, yet that authority came wrapped in danger. The moment she became queen, she inherited not only a throne, but also a kingdom fractured by famine, internal corruption, and Rome's suffocating influence. And standing beside her, quite literally fidgeting with the royal diadem, was her brother, a child surrounded by adults eager to manipulate him. The court reacted instantly. Advisors loyal to Cleopatra celebrated quietly, knowing she possessed the intellect and charisma to lead. Meanwhile, the entourage around Ptolemy XIII, most notably the ambitious eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, tightened their ranks. They had no intention of letting Cleopatra become the dominant ruler. They wanted a puppet king, not a queen with her own mind, her own alliances, and a talent for speaking multiple languages fluently enough to negotiate her way out of disaster. Cleopatra, however, refused to be overshadowed. She took immediate steps to assert herself. She appeared alone on coins, a bold move that signalled to Egypt and Rome alike which sibling held real authority. She addressed officials directly without filtering her commands through her brother. She met with foreign envoys personally, charming them in their own languages, and she began repairing Egypt's finances, reducing taxes in some regions, and stabilizing grain distribution. Her early actions revealed a truth that palace insiders already suspected. Cleopatra was not going to be a ceremonial co-ruler. She intended to govern. But her confidence also intensified resistance. Pothinus and his faction began plotting against her almost immediately, whispering to Ptolemy XIII that his sister sought absolute power. They painted her as dangerous, disobedient, and too independent for a proper royal woman. Cleopatra had taken the throne with brilliance and determination, but now the very talents that made her an extraordinary ruler would be used against her. The storm was coming, and her brother would soon become her greatest enemy. Cleopatra VII had barely settled into her role as queen when the storm she had been anticipating finally broke over her head. The faction surrounding her brother, Ptolemy XIII, guided by the ever-scheming Pothinus and supported by the ambitious general Achilles, decided that Egypt needed exactly one ruler, and preferably a male one they could control like a puppet on golden strings. Cleopatra, with her intellect, assertiveness, and refusal to be sidelined, was far too dangerous for their plans. The tension escalated quietly at first. Letters went missing. Cleopatra's political allies were reassigned or pressured. Royal decrees she issued were accidentally delayed. Foreign envoys found themselves redirected to Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra recognized the signs. This was a political strangulation performed with velvet gloves, but she refused to fold. She confronted ministers, bypassed obstructive officials, and continued ruling with authority that made her brother's advisors sweat. Eventually, subtle sabotage wasn't enough for her rivals. They needed Cleopatra gone. The decisive blow came when Pothinus engineered a full political coup. Cleopatra, still a teenager but already too formidable to kill without risking public outrage, was pushed out of Alexandria. Surrounded by enemies, deprived of her administrative powers, and practically escorted to the edge of her own kingdom, she faced a choice: flee and vanish like countless dethroned royals before her, or fight. Cleopatra chose to fight. She slipped out of the capital with a small group of loyal supporters and travelled east into the deserts near Pelusium. There, she began gathering an army. Even in exile, she wielded charisma like a weapon. Tribal leaders, mercenaries, and regional governors pledged support. She secured funds, supplies, and political connections. She planned not just a return, but a triumphant one. Yet Cleopatra's teenage exile was more than a logistical challenge. It was the moment she understood what kind of ruler she would have to become. Not merely intelligent, not merely diplomatic. She would need to be bold enough to defy her own family, clever enough to outmaneuver Rome, and resilient enough to rise from any downfall. Her teenage years ended not with a coronation, but with a rebellion in her name, and a gamble that would change the world. As she prepared to reclaim Egypt, a new force entered the region: Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra, now hardened by betrayal and sharpened by exile, was ready to meet him, not as a victim, but as a queen destined for legend. The Library of Alexandria did not emerge from modest ambitions or gentle curiosity. It was born from a dynasty that wanted the entire world's knowledge stacked neatly on its shelves. When the early Ptolemies forged their capital on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, they envisioned a city that would eclipse Athens, Babylon, and every other intellectual centre in history. They weren't interested in being one of the great powers. They intended to become the gravitational centre of human thought. And so, at the heart of this glittering new metropolis, they built the library. But library hardly does it justice. This was not a quiet room with scrolls gathering dust. It was a colossal machine for absorbing wisdom. The Ptolemies ordered that every ship entering Alexandria's harbour be searched, and any scrolls found — philosophy, poetry, mathematics, medicine, engineering — were taken to the library. The originals were kept. Copies were returned. Alexandria essentially invented state-sponsored intellectual theft, and did it with such elegance that the rest of the world almost admired the audacity. Inside the library's walls, knowledge was alive. Thousands of scholars lived, worked, debated, argued, and occasionally infuriated each other within its courtyards. They came from Greece, Egypt, Persia, Judea, North Africa, and beyond, drawn by the promise of endless scrolls and royal stipends. The library's mission was not simply to collect wisdom, but to refine it, categorize it, challenge it, and expand it. They wanted to understand how the heavens moved, how the human body functioned, how languages connected, and why the world behaved as it did. In many ways, it was the first research university ever created. Walking through its halls meant hearing theories in 10 languages, smelling ink drying on new scrolls, and witnessing discoveries that would shape centuries. Here, scholars mapped the stars, measured the Earth with shocking accuracy, dissected texts from distant cultures, and wrote treatises that would echo across time. The library wasn't just a building, it was a statement, a declaration that Alexandria intended to rule not only through armies and wealth, but through knowledge. It was a monument to human curiosity, built by rulers who believed that wisdom itself was a form of power. But as magnificent as it was, the library's brilliance also made it fragile. Anything that shines that brightly inevitably casts a shadow, and many forces, from politics to war, would soon begin reaching for it. The Library of Alexandria did not simply gather scrolls. It gathered the brightest minds from every corner of the ancient world. It became a magnet for thinkers the way gold attracts thieves. Anyone with a reputation for brilliance — poets, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, linguists — found their way to Alexandria sooner or later, drawn by the promise of royal patronage and limitless intellectual playgrounds. The library offered what no other institution could: time, resources, and freedom from the mundane burdens of survival. Scholars here were fed, housed, and paid to think. Imagine the energy inside those walls. Arguments shattered the silence like thunder. One hallway echoed with debates about the nature of the cosmos, another with discussions on anatomy or the structure of poetry. It was chaotic, competitive, and occasionally petty, because when you place hundreds of geniuses in one location, someone's ego is guaranteed to combust. But the tension was productive. It pushed ideas forward. Zeno's students philosophized under shaded colonnades. Physicians dissected animals to understand the human body. Linguists compared scripts brought from distant kingdoms. Astronomers charted the paths of wandering stars. Mathematicians scribbled equations on wax tablets, occasionally discovering formulas that would haunt and inspire classrooms for thousands of years. These scholars weren't merely reading the world's knowledge, they were expanding it. One of the library's most important innovations was collaboration. It dissolved borders. A Greek philosopher might debate theology with a Jewish scholar. An Egyptian priest steeped in hieroglyphic traditions might compare notes with a traveller from India. Knowledge flowed across languages and cultures, mixing like the currents of the Mediterranean itself. The library became a living conversation, one so vast and continuous that no single lifetime could contain it. This environment produced breakthroughs that modern science still respects. The circumference of the Earth was calculated with astonishing accuracy. The foundations of geometry were refined. Early theories of evolution, atoms, and planetary motion were recorded. Plays were analysed. Histories were compiled. Medical treatises pushed boundaries. The world had never seen such a concentrated, state-funded explosion of intellect. For centuries, kings built monuments to prove their power. Alexandria built mines, and yet, for all its brilliance, this intellectual paradise existed under constant strain. Greatness like this does not exist in a vacuum. It attracts admiration, envy, and eventually, danger. For now, the library flourished, but the seeds of its destruction were already being planted just beyond its shining walls. If the scholars were the heart of the Library of Alexandria, its collection strategy was the bloodstream pumping ideas into it. The Ptolemies were not passive collectors. They were obsessively, aggressively devoted to obtaining every scrap of knowledge the ancient world had produced. Their mission was simple and impossibly ambitious: assemble all written works under one roof. And in pursuit of this goal, the library developed methods that ranged from brilliant to borderline criminal. The most famous tactic unfolded right in the harbour. Every ship that entered Alexandria was searched by royal decree. Officials confiscated any scrolls found aboard, scientific treatises, poetry, religious works, medical manuals, navigational logs. The texts were rushed to the library, copied by expert scribes, and the copies returned to the owners. The originals, considered of higher quality, remained in the library. This practice earned the collection the legendary title, The Books of the Ships. But the Ptolemies did not stop there. They purchased scrolls from markets across Greece, Africa, and the Near East. Agents were dispatched with enormous budgets to acquire rare manuscripts at any cost. Scholars travelling abroad were instructed not only to study, but to obtain texts from foreign libraries, legally if possible, creatively if necessary. Alexandria became famous for its hunger, a city whose rulers wanted knowledge the way other kings wanted land. The library also collected texts through translation. When ambassadors from faraway kingdoms visited Alexandria, they brought works in their own languages as diplomatic gifts. Instead of letting them sit unused, the library established one of the world's first organised translation centres. Here, multilingual scholars rendered foreign ideas into Greek, allowing knowledge to spill across cultural boundaries. Philosophy from India, stories from the Middle East, histories from Persia, and local Egyptian wisdom all found their place in the shelves. This relentless accumulation created a collection of staggering scope, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, possibly nearing 1 million. No one could read everything the library possessed, not even in several lifetimes. That was the point. The library was not designed for individuals. It was designed for civilization. Yet such an insatiable appetite came with risk. Alexandria was gathering not just knowledge but responsibility. The more it collected, the more irreplaceable it became, and the more devastating any loss would be. As the library swelled with the world's wisdom, its destruction became unthinkable. But history does not protect brilliance. It tests it. For all its ambition, the Library of Alexandria would have been a labyrinth of chaos, if not for the brilliance of the scholars who organised it. The greatest of these was Callimachus, a poet-scholar whose mind operated like a perfectly tuned filing system. Under his guidance, the library created something revolutionary: the Pinnaces, a massive multi-volume catalogue that served as the intellectual spine of the entire institution. This was no simple list. The Pinnakies arranged authors by genre, summarised their works, recorded biographical notes, and classified texts with a precision unmatched for centuries. It was essentially the ancient world's first comprehensive database, a search engine written on papyrus. Thanks to Callimachus, scholars could navigate the vast collections without drowning in scrolls. A researcher studying medicine could instantly find every known treatise on anatomy, while a poet could trace the evolution of epic storytelling across cultures. But Alexandria's organizational genius did not stop at cataloguing. The library employed curators who acted less like librarians and more like intellectual strategists. Their job was to guide scholars, preserve fragile scrolls, maintain translations, and ensure that knowledge flowed efficiently. They were the guardians of ideas, making sure nothing valuable was lost to neglect, insects, humidity, or simple confusion. Inside the library, specialization flourished. Mathematical texts were grouped for easy comparison. Literary works were arranged by style and region. Philosophical schools, Stoics, Epicureans, Aristotelians, each had their designated areas. The museum, the library's sister institution next door, housed lecture halls, dining rooms for scholars, gardens for debate, and long porticos where theories were constructed, challenged, and occasionally torn apart by rivals with sharper tongues. This environment produced giants. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy using shadows and geometry. Herophilus made groundbreaking anatomical discoveries. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric universe long before Copernicus. The library was not just cataloguing knowledge, it was generating it. Even the daily rituals reflected this obsessive pursuit of truth. Scholars ate together to encourage discussions. They copied texts not just to preserve them, but to understand them intimately. They argued for hours, sometimes days, refusing to let an idea rest until it had been pulled apart and rebuilt. With such order, innovation, and passion driving it, the library became a brain unlike any other, a single institution thinking on behalf of humanity. But brilliance this concentrated was also precarious. For every great discovery, there were political forces beyond the library's control. And soon, history would come knocking. To understand the Library of Alexandria, you must understand the city that breathed life into it. Alexandria was not merely a port or a capital, it was a deliberate experiment in cultural fusion. Founded by Alexander the Great and shaped by the Ptolemies, it blended Greek rationalism with Egyptian tradition, Persian scholarship, Jewish theology, African trade networks, and the restless energy of sailors arriving from every corner of the Mediterranean. It was a place where a fisherman might walk past a philosopher, where temple rituals coexisted with cutting-edge mathematics, and where knowledge felt as abundant as the sea breeze. The library was the centerpiece of this identity. As Alexandria became a beacon, it drew people in waves. Wealthy merchants funded expeditions. Foreign dignitaries arrived bearing scrolls as diplomatic gifts. Intellectual refugees fleeing wars or political upheaval found sanctuary within its colonnades. The city's streets buzzed with accents from Cyrene, Syria, Judea, India, and Macedonia. Alexandria did not merely welcome diversity, it depended on it. This cosmopolitan ecosystem supercharged the library. A scholar could step outside its doors and immediately access a living laboratory of cultures and languages. Markets overflowed with goods and stories from distant lands. Harbour workers shouted in multiple tongues, mixing slang from half the known world. Temples displayed carvings that hinted at ancient mysteries. For researchers, this was paradise. Raw data arrived daily, ferried in by merchants, diplomats, and travellers. The museum, part research centre, part university, part sanctuary, embodied this spirit. Scholars lived there, ate there, and debated there until long after the sun had set over the Pharos lighthouse. The institution thrived on diversity of thought, proving that ideas grow stronger when exposed to contradiction and challenge. A Greek mathematician might refine a theorem using Egyptian surveying techniques. A Jewish scholar could compare scripture with Babylonian histories. Physicians dissected animal bodies, while philosophers argued about the nature of the soul in the courtyard. This intellectual melting pot made Alexandria feel invincible, as if the sheer concentration of brilliance could protect it from the world's brutality. And for a time, it did. But outside the city's glittering walls, empires shifted, jealousies stirred, and military ambitions grew sharper. Alexandria believed it could stand above politics, a city too important to burn, too wise to fall. History, however, has little patience for arrogance. And while the library blossomed in this golden age, the forces that would one day threaten it were already gathering beyond the horizon. For centuries, the Library of Alexandria had lived in a bubble of intellectual idealism, protected by kings, admired by scholars, and nourished by the wealth of Egypt. But the ancient world was not a peaceful place, and the day came when Alexandria's brilliance collided with the brutal machinery of empire. The spark was a civil war far from Egyptian shores, the struggle between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge from a kingdom he believed owed him loyalty. But Ptolemy XIII's advisors, eager to impress Caesar, murdered Pompey and presented his severed head as a gift. Caesar, horrified and insulted by this grotesque display, marched into Alexandria in 48 BCE to restore order. What he found instead was a royal family in chaos, Cleopatra VII fighting for her throne, and a city simmering with political tension. Alexandria, normally a sanctuary for scholars, suddenly became a battlefield. The library sat perilously close to the fighting, physically near the harbour, symbolically near the heart of the conflict. Caesar took control of the royal quarter, fortifying it against the forces loyal to Ptolemy XIII. Street battles erupted, siege engines were constructed, and in the midst of this chaos, the unthinkable happened. Flames spread through the docks and storehouses. Ancient sources disagree on how far the fire reached, but one truth echoes through history. Scrolls were lost. Some say the blaze consumed warehouses holding tens of thousands of manuscripts, texts waiting to be brought into the library. Others insist the flames reached auxiliary collections connected to the library itself. However the details unfolded, the result was the same: the first great wound in Alexandria's memory. Imagine a scholar standing on the library's steps, watching smoke rise over the harbour, unsure how much knowledge was vanishing into the fire. These were not mere scrolls. They were centuries of research, poetry, maps, medical treatises, histories, plays, and scientific theories that could never be recreated. Caesar eventually won the Alexandrian War with Cleopatra at his side, but the library had already paid a terrible price. For the first time, Alexandria learned that ideas could burn, and that even the greatest repository of human wisdom was vulnerable to the ambitions of men with swords. The library survived, but not unchanged. A shadow had fallen over it, a warning of tragedies still to come. After Caesar's war and Cleopatra's dramatic rise to power, the Library of Alexandria continued to function. But the golden age was fading. The institution did not collapse in a single day. Instead, it entered a long, painful period of decline, chipped away by forces far more subtle than fire. The world was changing, empires were shifting, and the Ptolemies were no longer the bold, book-hungry dynasty they once were. The intellectual engine that had powered Alexandria for centuries was still running, but it sputtered more with each generation. The first problem was political instability. Cleopatra's alliance with Rome, first through Caesar and then through Mark Antony, placed Egypt at the centre of Roman suspicion. After their defeat at the hands of Octavian, soon to be Augustus, Alexandria fell under Roman control. Rome admired Greek learning, but it preferred knowledge that served imperial needs. Funding for the museum and library became inconsistent. Stipends to scholars were reduced. The once vibrant institution began to shrink, not through destruction, but through neglect. Another problem was competition. As Rome expanded, so did its cultural centres. Cities like Pergamon, Athens, and later even Rome itself developed libraries that rivaled Alexandria. Scholars who once flocked to Egypt now found alternatives closer to home or more politically stable. The library was no longer the only beacon. It was one light among many. Then came religious shifts. Over the next centuries, Alexandria became a melting pot, not just of cultures, but of ideologies. Judaism, Christianity, traditional Egyptian religion, and Greek paganism coexisted uneasily. Intellectual debate gradually morphed into doctrinal conflict. The library, once a neutral ground for ideas, found itself entangled in disputes it had never been designed to handle. Knowledge that had once been celebrated for diversity became suspect if it contradicted theology or political narratives. Even daily life in Alexandria changed. Economic pressures strained the city. Earthquakes damaged buildings. Trade patterns shifted. The library, which required constant copying and preservation to survive, suffered in periods of scarcity. Papyrus decayed. Scrolls went unrepaired. Entire collections were left vulnerable to time. Yet throughout this decline, individuals still worked to preserve what they could. Scholars continued writing. Teachers continued lecturing. The library remained a symbol of what humanity could achieve, even as the world around it grew darker. The tragedy of Alexandria was not that it fell, it was that it faded. The greatest repository of knowledge ever built was being slowly worn down, not by a single enemy, but by centuries of changing tides. By the time the Roman Empire tightened its grip on Egypt, the Library of Alexandria was already weakened, but not yet destroyed. What followed was not a single catastrophic blaze, as later legends claim, but a series of blows delivered over centuries. Each one chipped away at the institution until, finally, there was nothing left to recognize. The tragedy of the library is not that it died once, but that it died many times. One of its earliest major wounds, long after Caesar's fire, likely came during the Roman Emperor Aurelian's campaign in the 3rd century CE. Fighting to reclaim Alexandria from the rebel Queen Zenobia's forces, his troops tore through the city's Bruchion district, the very neighbourhood where the library and museum once stood. Ancient writers mention the destruction of the Bruchion, a phrase heavy with implication. Even if the heart of the library had survived earlier turmoil, it is difficult to imagine it enduring a full-scale military assault unscathed. Scrolls do not fare well against battering rams, but even after that, Alexandria retained smaller libraries, including the Serapeium, a temple complex that held a significant portion of the library's surviving collections. This building became the final refuge for Alexandria's intellectual heritage. For a time, it thrived. Scholars still lectured inside. Students still copied texts. The Serapeium may never have matched the grandeur of the original library, but it carried its spirit. Then the ideological landscape shifted again. As Christianity spread through the empire, Alexandria became a battleground of competing worldviews. The city saw riots, theological clashes, and periods of violent unrest. In 391 CE, under Emperor Theodosius, pagan temples were outlawed. The Serapeium, being both a temple and a library, became a target. Accounts differ on the exact details, but all point to the same outcome. The Serapeium was destroyed, its scrolls lost or scattered. With it vanished the last physical remnant of the library. Yet even this was not the absolute end. The mathematician Hypatia, one of Alexandria's last great scholars, continued teaching into the early 5th century. Her brutal murder by a Christian mob symbolized something deeper than personal tragedy. It marked the extinguishing of Alexandria's intellectual flame. After her death, the city never again served as the world's academic capital. By the time the dust settled, centuries of fire, war, extremism, and simple neglect had erased the library. Not in a single legendary night, but piece by piece, until silence replaced what was once the beating heart of human knowledge. When the last embers faded, and the halls of the Library of Alexandria finally fell silent, the world did not immediately understand what it had lost. Ancient cities had burned before, temples had fallen, empires had crumbled, but no destruction had ever carried consequences quite like this one. The library had not been a building, it had been a memory machine for civilization. And when it disappeared, entire chapters of human knowledge vanished with it. We will never know the full extent of what burned. That is the cruelest irony. When you lose an archive, you lose the list of what you lost. But historians can guess. Plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides that were never copied elsewhere. Philosophical schools whose teachings survive only in fragments and second-hand references. Scientific treatises from Babylon, Persia, and Egypt that could have advanced mathematics and astronomy centuries earlier. Medical knowledge based on dissections forbidden in later eras. Entire world histories, Phoenician, Carthaginian, North African, that exist now only as whispers. The library did not merely store books, it stored possibilities. But the story is not entirely bleak. Some fragments escaped. Works translated in Alexandria found new life in the Islamic Golden Age, copied and preserved in libraries from Baghdad to Cordoba. Greek philosophy, once organized and studied in Alexandria, eventually fueled the Renaissance. Even the idea of a library as a universal repository, a place where knowledge from many cultures is preserved together, survived. It passed like a torch from civilization to civilization, reminding humanity that memory is a form of power. And something deeper survived as well, the myth of the library. For centuries, poets, philosophers, and historians spoke of it with awe. Dead though it was, it became a symbol of human potential, of what can be achieved when a society values learning above war, curiosity above conquest. The library's story has inspired archaeologists, writers, and dreamers to imagine a world where knowledge flows freely across borders. Yet its destruction remains a warning. Knowledge is fragile. Ideas require protection. Libraries, though built of stone, can die as easily as the people who defend them. The fall of Alexandria reminds us that progress is not guaranteed, and that the light of understanding must be guarded in every generation. The greatest treasure humanity ever collected did not survive. But the desire to rebuild it, to gather wisdom, preserve it, and share it, endures. In that sense, the Library of Alexandria is not gone. It is still being written. In the medieval world, few diagnoses carried as much fear, misunderstanding, and despair as leprosy. To most societies, it was a sentence, an exile from family, community, and even humanity itself. But the order of St. Lazarus, the famed leper knights, defied that fate entirely. They were not hidden away or erased from existence. They were gathered, organized, armed, and given a purpose that blended religion, healing, and quiet martial courage. Their green cross, stitched onto their cloaks, became a symbol of both suffering and sanctity, marking them as men who walked with death but did not bow to it. Most lepers were sent to isolated hospitals or pushed to the outskirts of towns, living off charity and prayer. But those who joined the order were offered something radically different: brotherhood. Instead of being defined by decay, they were defined by discipline. Instead of being shunned, they were welcomed by a community that understood hardship intimately. And instead of being forced into passive isolation, they were trained, sometimes lightly, sometimes rigorously, to defend Christian pilgrims and Holy Land fortresses where disease had already taken root. Their initiation ritual reflected this dual existence. A new brother first stood before the altar, acknowledging openly the illness that had begun to transform him. The order made no attempt to hide the truth. Leprosy was not a rumour here, but a shared reality. The initiate confessed not sins of the soul, but the fears of the flesh. Fear of pain, of rejection, of inevitable decline. The priests listened, then anointed him with consecrated oil, not as a cure, but as a blessing for endurance. Healing, in their eyes, meant strength of spirit, not restoration of the body. From there, the initiate received the green cross. The ritual was quiet, almost monastic. No grand ceremony, no fanfare. just the solemn placing of a cloth symbol onto a man who understood more deeply than most that life was finite. The moment was transformative, not because it removed suffering, but because it reframed it. The cross did not deny their disease, it sanctified their struggle against it. These men were not expected to live long. Many had already begun to lose sensation in their hands, or patches of skin had started to pale. Yet in the order of St. Lazarus, they found dignity, purpose, and a strange kind of freedom. The freedom of men who had nothing left to fear. For the leper knights, purification was not a symbolic gesture performed for tradition's sake. It was a necessity woven into daily survival. Their bodies changed slowly, painfully, and unpredictably, and so their rituals of cleansing served a dual purpose: spiritual preparation and medical discipline. Every morning, before prayer or training, the brothers gathered in the courtyard's stone basins for what they called the washing of the affliction. It was not baptism, nor was it simple hygiene. It was a ritual acknowledgement of the battle being fought beneath their skin. The water, drawn from wells lined with lime and blessed by the order's chaplains, was mixed with crushed herbs and coarse salt. Physicians of the order, many of whom suffered from the disease themselves, believed these mixtures slowed the spread of infection. Whether it worked scientifically, the brothers hardly cared. What mattered was the feeling, the cold sting on numbing limbs, the sharp bite of salt in wounds that refused to heal, the faint scent of rosemary and myrrh rising into the morning air. Every sensation reminded them that while their bodies faltered, their spirits remained awake. Before stepping into the basins, each knight murmured a simple prayer: "Let my flesh weaken, but not my resolve." The words were not ancient scripture, merely a vow passed from brother to brother. The order treasured it more than any formal liturgy. As they washed, the chaplains walked slowly along the edge of the courtyard, whispering blessings for endurance, courage, and clarity of mind. These were not dramatic miracles. No one expected healing. But the ritual offered calm, and calm was its own kind of medicine. After the washing came the anointing. A thin salve of oil and resin was rubbed onto their hands, feet, and faces by fellow knights. This act, a man with damaged flesh tending to another, created a bond deeper than any battlefield oath. In touching each other's wounds, they destroyed the isolation that plagued so many medieval lepers. Here, they were not outcasts. They were comrades united by suffering. Once purified, the brothers dried their limbs with simple linen cloths and dressed slowly, mindful of tender skin and lost sensation. Then they gathered in the chapel for morning prayer, their green crosses catching faint light through stained glass windows. Purification had not cured them, and they knew it never would, but it steadied the heart. And for men who lived with death whispering constantly at their backs, a steady heart was a miracle in itself. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the ramparts and long shadows stretched across the leprosarium courtyard, the leper knights gathered for the ritual that defined their order more than any oath of battle: the vigil of the Green Cross. Unlike morning purification, which focused on the physical struggle, the vigil addressed the deeper wounds: fear, loneliness, and the quiet sorrow of watching one's body fade inch by inch. It was here, beneath flickering lamps and the cool breath of night, that the brothers sought not deliverance from illness, but the strength to endure it. The vigil began in silence. The knights filed into the chapel one by one, moving slowly, some leaning on carved wooden staffs, others guided by brothers whose fingers had not yet gone numb. The chapel was dim, lit with only a few candles, their flames dancing gently against the stone walls. At the centre stood a simple wooden cross painted green, not gold, not silver, but the humble colour of medicinal herbs and hope. The green cross reminded the knights that healing took many forms, and that sometimes the only cure was acceptance. Once all were gathered, the chaplain recited the first prayer: "We do not ask to be restored, but to be steadfast." These words, soft and unwavering, echoed through the chapel. They were a direct rejection of pity. The knights did not pray for miracles. They prayed for dignity, for clarity of mind, for the ability to face each day with grace even as their bodies weakened. They asked for the strength to remain gentle, to resist bitterness, and to uphold their oaths despite their suffering. After the communal prayer came the offering of candles. Each knight stepped forward and placed a small wax taper at the foot of the green cross. Some held the candles gingerly with damaged hands. Others used both palms to steady their grip. The act symbolized a personal burden surrendered, not erased, but shared among brothers. As more candles were placed, the green cross glowed softly in the warm halo of light. Then came the chant. Low, rhythmic, and almost monastic, it filled the chapel like a heartbeat. The knights' voices, roughened by illness yet steady with resolve, blended into one continuous hum. For a few moments, the pain in their limbs, the numbness in their nerves, and the fear of tomorrow faded beneath the unity of sound. The vigil ended as quietly as it began. Each knight left the chapel carrying not a cure, but something far more sustaining: peace, acceptance, and the understanding that their suffering was not borne alone. The leper knights lived in a paradox. They were warriors whose bodies were gradually abandoning them. Yet discipline, rigorous, unyielding, and purposeful, remained central to their identity. Though few of them would ever ride into battle like the knights of other orders, they still trained. Not because victory was likely, but because discipline granted them dignity. To the brothers of St. Lazarus, the act of training was itself a ritual, a declaration that illness would not claim their spirit, even as it claimed their flesh. Training sessions took place in the early afternoon, after the heat of the sun had softened. The courtyard rang with the dull clatter of wooden practice swords. Some knights used modified weapons with thicker grips to compensate for numb fingers. Others practiced defensive maneuvers, focusing on footwork to maintain balance despite weakened nerves. Every movement was deliberate. Every strike was a negotiation with pain. No one was mocked for weakness, because everyone was weak. Here, the smallest success was celebrated. A clean parry, a steady stance, a moment of strength in hands that trembled minutes before. Their instructors, often elder knights who had lived with the disease for decades, knew exactly how to guide their students. They corrected posture gently, offering advice tailored to each brother's stage of illness. They knew which joints were prone to collapse, which muscles still responded, and which techniques could be adapted for the afflicted. Beyond weapons training, the knights practiced coordinated drills. They moved in small formations, learning to fight as a unit rather than as individuals. This was not merely tactical, it was protective. A knight whose vision had begun to blur was paired with one who still saw clearly. A knight with weakened legs marched beside one whose stride remained strong. Each man compensated for another's weakness. Their unity was their strength. The training yard also served as a place of emotional trial. Many brothers confronted frustration, anger, or grief as they attempted tasks that once came easily. Yet the ritual demanded perseverance, not perfection. Every swing of the sword reaffirmed their will to live with purpose. At the end of each session, the knights placed their practice weapons in a single wooden rack. This final gesture symbolized their shared burdens and shared resilience. They were not warriors because they won battles. They were warriors because they continued to fight against illness, despair, and the slow fading of the body. Their discipline was not about strength. It was about defiance. In most medieval orders, mealtime was a simple routine, nourishment for the body before returning to work or prayer. But for the leper knights, meals were a sacred ritual, one that blended practicality, compassion, and a profound sense of equality. Many of the brothers struggled to swallow, to taste, or to lift food with damaged hands. Eating was not merely a physical act, it was a reminder of the slow march of illness. And so, the order transformed mealtime into something gentler, more dignified, an act of mercy performed every single day. The ritual began with a soft bell. The brothers filed into the refectory at their own pace, some limping, some leaning on staffs, others guided by arms they could no longer feel. The long wooden tables were arranged in a square, a design meant to ensure every man could see every other. No one sat hidden, no one dined alone. The chaplain offered a brief blessing, not asking for healing, but for patience and gratitude. Let this meal strengthen what remains unharmed within us. It was a reminder that their spirits, not their bodies, were the true recipients of nourishment. Meals were simple but thoughtfully prepared. Broths rich with herbs soothed inflamed throats. Soft bread, dipped in oil, required little chewing. Honeyed water eased pain. Those whose hands had become stiff were served by their brothers. The order considered this an honour, not a burden. To feed another man, especially one ravaged by leprosy, was to affirm his humanity. In a world that often treated lepers as untouchable, the refectory became a place of radical closeness. As they ate, the room filled with quiet conversation. Some discussed scripture or philosophy. Others spoke of their families, now distant or gone. A few shared dark humour about their afflictions, a coping mechanism as old as disease itself. Laughter was rare but cherished. It echoed strangely in the hall, like a spark fighting the wind. At the end of the meal, each knight placed his wooden bowl into a basin of warm water. The act symbolised purification not just of hands, but of sorrow. No one left the room until every man had finished, even the slowest among them. The order refused to let illness isolate its members. Every brother, regardless of the severity of his condition, was part of the communal rhythm. In these meals, the leper knights built a quiet, stubborn form of resistance. The world may have marked them for death, but within these walls they tasted dignity, one spoonful at a time. When darkness settled over the leprosarium and most of the brothers slept, a small group remained awake for one of the order's most solemn responsibilities, the night watch. This ritual was not military vigilance in the traditional sense. No enemy armies stood poised outside their walls. Instead, the night watch guarded something far more fragile than territory: the lives, fears, and final moments of men whose bodies were slowly betraying them. For the leper knights, to keep watch at night was to honour suffering with presence, not with swords. The watch began shortly after the final prayers. 3 brothers were chosen each evening, rotating so that no one carried the burden too often. They wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks, not for warmth. Many felt little cold, but to shield their damaged skin from the night air. Each received a lantern, a wooden staff, and a small pouch of herbs meant to soothe those who cried out in pain during the night. Their rounds took them through long stone corridors lined with simple beds. Some brothers slept peacefully, others shifted restlessly, murmuring in fevered dreams. The watchers moved silently, pausing at each bed to ensure the sleeper still breathed. They adjusted blankets, dabbed salves onto cracked skin, whispered prayers into ears too weak to respond. These gestures were small, but in the order, small kindnesses mattered more than any battlefield triumph. Outside the living quarters lay the garden path, where the watchers walked to clear their minds. The soft glow of lanterns illuminated patches of mint and sage, plants used for treating sores, infections, and the spiritual fatigue that clung to the order like a shadow. Here the watchers often paused, letting the cool breeze settle around them. Some silently processed their own fear. Fear of worsening symptoms, fear of blindness, fear of becoming the next brother whose breath they would check in vain. The final stop of the night watch was the chapel. The green cross glowed faintly in the moonlight through stained glass windows. The watchers knelt, offering prayers not for strength in combat, but for strength to continue performing this quiet service. It was easy to swing a sword. It was far harder to witness suffering night after night without turning away. By dawn, the watchers returned to their beds, weary but fulfilled. Their duty was not heroic in the traditional sense. It was humble, steady, and deeply human. In a world that feared them, the leper knights chose to protect one another, not from enemies, but from loneliness. Among the leper knights, death was not an unexpected visitor. It was a constant companion. Yet the order refused to let it arrive unacknowledged or unprepared for. When a brother's illness advanced beyond recovery, When numbness crept too far or fever hollowed the eyes, the community performed one of its most intimate rituals, the rite of the fading. It was not a funeral, nor was it a last confession. It was a ceremony of dignity for men who had spent their final years stripped of everything but their courage. The ritual began quietly, usually at dusk. A brother who sensed his end approaching would request the rite, though sometimes the chaplain made the decision gently on his behalf. The chosen man was washed one final time, not with the brisk practical motions of morning purification, but with slow, reverent care. Warm water mixed with herbs was poured over his hands, face and feet. Even if he could no longer feel the touch, it symbolized the community's promise. You will not leave this world unseen. After washing, the brother was clothed in a clean tunic, dyed with a faint green thread. Bright colours were avoided. Humility guided every detail. The green, subtle, yet unmistakable, marked his belonging to the order of St. Lazarus even in death. Once dressed, he was led, often supported by two brothers, into the chapel, where a circle of knights awaited him. The rite of the fading included no grand sermons. Instead, the chaplain invited the dying man to speak if he wished. Some offered memories of battles fought before illness claimed their strength. Others spoke of families left behind, of regrets, of unexpected peace found among men who understood their suffering. But many simply closed their eyes and listened, content to be surrounded by the voices of their brothers. Then came the laying on of hands. One by one, each knight stepped forward, placing a hand, sometimes a scarred one, sometimes a shaking one, on the fading brother's shoulder. In that moment, no man felt ashamed of his wounds. Wounds were the very bond they shared. The contact symbolized unity, a final reminder that he belonged to them, and they to him. A final prayer followed. May your suffering end, and your courage remain with us. The dying brother was then escorted back to his bed, where he would spend his last hours or days watched by those who loved him in silence. For the leper knights, the rite of the fading ensured that no man crossed the threshold alone. Their world had abandoned them long ago, but they had never abandoned one another. For most medieval warriors, marching into battle meant weighing the chances of survival. For the leper knights, the calculation was different. They marched knowing death already lived inside them, advancing quietly beneath their skin. This certainty gave their order a strange, almost unsettling courage. Men who had already accepted death did not fear it on the battlefield. And so, when the Order of St. Lazarus rode into combat, rarely and always in desperate moments, they carried a presence that unnerved even seasoned soldiers. Their illness shaped everything about their preparations. Before any march, the brothers performed a ritual unlike that of any other military order, the blessing of the failing flesh. Each knight stood before the chaplain, who traced a small green cross over weakened limbs, numb hands, swollen joints, eyes beginning to cloud. The blessing acknowledged what all of them knew: these bodies were fragile, unpredictable, and often painful. Yet each was still capable of service. Their armour was lighter than that of other knights, not out of cowardice, but practicality. Heavy mail was unbearable for men whose nerves were deteriorating. Instead, they wore layered cloth reinforced with leather and metal plates. It offered less protection, but allowed them to breathe, move, and endure the strain. Their weapons were simple, mostly swords or maces, with grips wrapped thickly to compensate for diminishing sensation. Despite their limitations, the leper knights fought with a steady, relentless determination. Their ranks often formed at the centre or rear of an army, where discipline mattered more than raw strength. They guarded wounded soldiers, protected supply lines, or held chapels and hospitals against attack. When the situation grew desperate, they advanced, not with the reckless fury of youth, but with a calm resolve that felt almost supernatural. Their enemies sometimes hesitated to strike them. Rumours spread across battlefields. These men were afflicted, death-marked, chosen by God, cursed, fearless, already half gone. But the leper knights themselves rejected both pity and superstition. They fought because it was their oath. They fought because they refused to be defined by suffering. And they fought because for many of them, battle was one of the few moments when they could forget their disease entirely. At the end of each march, whether victorious or defeated, the brothers gathered for a final prayer. Not for glory, not for long life, but for the strength to face whatever remained, whether it was another dawn, another battle, or the quiet arrival of death itself. When the medieval world finally changed, when Crusader kingdoms fell, when new medical knowledge emerged, when leper hospitals slowly emptied, the Order of St. Lazarus faced a question few institutions ever confront. What happens to an order built by men already dying, once the world around them moves on? The leper knights did not vanish in a single dramatic collapse. Instead, like many of the brothers themselves, they faded gradually, quietly, leaving behind a legacy more spiritual than martial. Their decline began as treatments for leprosy improved, and isolation laws softened. Fewer afflicted men sought the order's refuge. Castles and hospitals once filled with the solemn chants of sick knights became sparsely populated. Yet even as their numbers dwindled, the rituals they created, the washing of affliction, the vigil of the green cross, the night watch, the rite of the fading, remained preserved in manuscripts and memories. Monks copied their liturgies. Physicians recorded their medical practices, recognizing that these knights, though untrained by universities, had learned to soothe suffering with remarkable insight. What endured most, however, was their attitude toward illness. The leper knights had crafted a culture in which the diseased were neither hidden nor feared, but honoured. They transformed isolation into community, agony into empathy, and despair into discipline. In doing so, they left a mark on medieval charity. Many later hospitals adopted their practice of communal meals, shared vigils, and gentle end-of-life care. Their example softened hearts in an age often brutal toward the weak. Their military contributions, though limited by necessity, became the stuff of legend. Chroniclers wrote of men marching into battle without fear, their green crosses glowing against pale skin. They wrote of warriors who protected hospitals more fiercely than others protected castles. They wrote of an order whose courage came not from strength, but from acceptance. The Knights of St. Lazarus became a symbol, not of triumph, but of endurance. In later centuries, the order reinvented itself, evolving into charitable and hospitaller organizations rather than a brotherhood of the afflicted. But the spirit of the old order, the humility, the solidarity, the refusal to let suffering erase dignity, remained embedded in its identity. Today, the leper knights survive mostly in stories, manuscripts, and the faded coats of arms preserved in old chapels. Yet their quiet bravery continues to resonate. They remind us that courage is not always found in victory or conquest. Sometimes it lies in endurance, in choosing to stand together when the world steps back in fear. Their bodies failed them. Their legacy did not.